Welcome, Persuasion students. Today we're going to be learning about my favorite topic in persuasion, and that's humor appeals and their impacts on persuasive elements, especially rhetorical dynamics that are inflicted upon audiences, both small and large. Let's talk about ways that humor is used to engage audiences and to get them to comply with certain components that are being asked and invited through the art of comedy. I'm going to say that humor has an important role to play in the art and processes of communication. Let's take a look at some of the communicative aspects that humor appeals offer within social interaction. For one, messages are rhetorical. They're often not literal. When we are listening to a joke, most of the makeup or composition of a joke or of an appeal and humor is not going to be concrete, that often we're looking at metaphors or other forms of visualization to get us to think about the message that's being espoused by the interlocutor. So in conclusion, messages are almost entirely rhetorical and not literal in the art of humor. Audiences are also forced to adapt to often the hidden messages and the context that's embedded within a joke. 95% of the time, it's going to take a lot of decoding from the audience member or from the person who's receiving the message in order to understand what the speaker is saying within communication and within that interaction. So the audience is put in this sort of weird, awkward position where often the communication is not literal, and so there's a lot more decoding that goes behind that. And that leads me to my next point, that third bullet down, unknown context can be discriminatory. What does that mean? That often means that if I am not understanding what you are saying within the context of a joke, that is now discriminating on my ability as a receiver to understand what you're saying and to try to provide some sort of response to that. We see this a lot in American culture with our international students who are from abroad. Your first few days in the United States, maybe you don't really understand some of the bizarre humor appeals that are being shared, especially sarcasm within our culture. A lot of folks from other countries don't understand American sarcasm, and that can also, show itself as being discriminatory in nature. I know I've already talked a lot about this, but the importance of decoding messages is of the utmost importance for that audience member. Because if they are not able to decode that message and understand it in its full entirety, then the speaker or the person who's initiated that message is not going to be able to receive a fulfilling response. Often we look at responses from humor as doing what? Laughter. Correct? And so decoding is number one, the most important aspect of that audience member or the role of the person who's receiving the message. And then finally, there's an essence of differentiation in humor appeals. Trying to understand more obvious versus subtle messages within humor can be challenging, right? And I will say, as a fan of stand-up comedy myself, if I am watching a new comic, whether it's supposed to be a raunchy comic or maybe a more introverted comic, there's going to be a learning curve there with understanding their humor within their act. And so we need to try to differentiate between obvious forms of humor and subtle forms of humor in terms of the impact that they're having on audiences. Before we can move forward with exploring humor appeals, let's define humor. According to Oxford Dictionary, humor is, quote, the quality of being amusing or comic, especially as expressed in literature or speech. Now, looking at literature or speech, those two concepts there are really sort of evoking the power of media. And so when we think of comic appeals or comedy appeals, we need to go beyond just media, right? We need to think of also a human being, a professor, a child, a lawyer, a doctor, or an athlete, an actual human being espousing humor or leveraging humor. It's also psychological and physiological shared components along with it. There is a mind aspect to it and a physical aspect to it. You'll learn in a minute that often the messages that we're receiving are going to be synthesized and then sort of released physiologically. Both visual and verbal stimulants cause psychological reactions or laughter as a physiological response. And then audience has a strong role to play in decoding messages. We call these enthymemes, right? So enthymemes are just ways that we try to use reasoning to figure out the end product of a message or sort of the output of a message. An enthymeme really is just having us fill in the blanks based on premises of information that we already know. So in a way, enthymematic strategies are employed, and that is what's so important about defining humor. Let's take a look at humor's communicative strategies because there are some five highly related strategies that humor uses to leverage persuasion in the most basic of contexts. The first one is identification. When we are using humor, it's often more easy that we are going to be able to identify with the person because humor has such an accessible feel for those of us in the Western Hemisphere that we can often identify with someone who's using humor. We can step inside their shoes and we can sort of see their own vision, their own version of world making through them. Another great strategy of humor is building rapport, that we can use our own senses of humor and relationship building and trying to gain compliance and gain folks to believe in what we're saying. Humor has the power to do that. A little bit further, I'd say a little bit more intensely, it could potentially disrupt social barriers. This also builds awareness of taboos throughout society and can help break down some of those rigid social barriers that we encompass and adopt here in the United States. Similarly to how mainstreaming affected and changed society based on constant syndication of social justice and other social barriers within media. And then finally, informational, instructional, and political benefits as well. Think about when you have such a hilarious professor like, myself. It can inspire you to learn more. Think of politicians too. Some of our most popular government officials were comedians. I think of Al Franken, who was actually a pretty disgraced senator now from the state of Minnesota, was a writer on Saturday Night Live. We also, had I don't know, the current president of Ukraine, who is currently leading the effort against the Russians. He too was a stand-up comedy and a comedic actor. We all know the desired result of humor is laughter, but it's not just the laughter or feeling of pleasure. It's something more impactful than that. And that's really to allow audience members or those receivers in communication to be more open to further acts of communication. So people like laughter. Laughter triggers endorphins. Endorphins affects the thought process in ways that allows the receivers to consider alternative messages. It's a brilliant process if you think about it. Humor really, truly impacts communication in ways that we don't really seem to understand until we're looking at it more closely. In this course, we really look at three major theories of persuasive humor. That is the superiority theory, which is the art of feeling above or better than the subject being laughed at. Relief theory is also used in humor. This is caused in situations where a feeling of tension is relieved, allowing for the humor to present itself. And then lastly, incongruity theory. This results of a break from an expected pattern or norm. We are going to go over each one of these theories momentarily. Superiority theory is the most common theory within humor appeals, and superiority theory can best be illustrated through stand-up comedy, truly. It can also be demonstrated through the art of impersonating, right? So skits, TV shows like Saturday Night Live or Mad TV often will be poking fun or impersonating major players in political and pop culture. That is the essence of superiority theory. That laughter is an expression of a person's feelings of superiority over other people. This creates a sense of being more successful than whatever is causing the laughter. This ignites audience applause and laughter, right? So laughing at ignorance, others as gaffes, not as smart, attractive, wealthy, or educated as ourselves. So one of my favorite stand-up comics is a young gay comedian. His name is Matteo Lane, and he's out of from New York City. And he does a stand-up routine that's truly poking fun at pharmacists. Now, I have friends who are pharmacists. I know that it takes a good education to become a pharmacist, but Matteo Lane does exemplify superiority theory pretty well here. Essentially, what he's doing is mocking a pharmacist because when we walk into a pharmacy, they are, back there behind the counter in a lab coat, right? And he is essentially saying, well, what kind of science is going on back there? Are you mixing chemicals? And the point is that he's poking fun at a pharmacist because there is literally no chemistry going on back there besides counting pills. Now, that, my friends, is the central exemplary sample of what superiority theory is. That a stand-up comic would be up there making fun of someone like a pharmacist and placing a pharmacist below the audience so that way the audience can laugh at that and place themselves over it as well. If you get a chance, Google Matteo Lane, Matteo Lane, and in Google, after Matteo Lane, type pharmacist lab coat. And check it out. It's kind of funny, and he's hilarious, and he has a really good mustache. Next, we move to the relief theory. Relief theory is pretty basic to understand. This theory argues that people experience humor based on some form of relief in stressful situations or stressful events. I love this slide. It's so basic. So, relief theory. People are relieved. As a result of people being relieved, nervous energy exits the body in some sort of laughter or some sort of, right? Laughter triggers endorphins. Therefore, relief theory makes us feel better after a stressful situation. Let's look at relief theory in context. Quote, often tension results from dissonance people experience after making a decision or sensing the approach of incompatible and undesirable thoughts or actions, end quote. So think about a time when you were super stressed, super panicked, and that moment right after the stress is relieved, we can now step back and enjoy the space, right? But there's something that often triggers that moment of relief, right? And so often that comes as a product of humor. So humor leveraged allows a pathway for healing beyond the stress and moving forward. And we can use humor in a way to relieve those stressful situations. So humor enhances and strengthens relief. A great recent example of relief theory came a few months ago with the 2022 Oscar Awards. And if we recall, comedian Chris Rock said something that offended Will Smith's wife. Will Smith, the actor, got up, marched to the stage, and punched Chris Rock across the face. Shortly after that, in a moment of panic, comedian Amy Schumer came out to try to relieve the audience of the tension and the stress that was the clock hit, punched heard around the world. And did she succeed at it? Not really, but if you get a chance, maybe you want to check out Amy Schumer's relief of the audience after Chris Rock was punched in the face. That, my friends, is relief theory in action. Incongruity theory is one of the more recent humor appeals that I think is demonstrative of a lot of the TV shows that we consume in our modern age. We think of TV shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, The Office, Modern Family. These are all TV shows that try to give a glimpse of what goes on sort of documentary style in the real world when things happen out of the norm. And so often those are moments that get us to laugh or at least make us feel so uncomfortable that humor appeals will take place. So incongruity theory states that laughter results from a violation of an expected norm. So why do we laugh at these? Perceived violations are unexpected, unconventional, and uncomfortable. Therefore, a lot of the laughter we experience in congruity theory is uncomfortable laughter. Think of, have you ever, started laughing at a funeral before, or a really awkward, uncomfortable situation? That's incongruity theory in practice. The element of surprise can enhance this, although it's not required. Of course, doing things out of the ordinary can be an element of surprise that can help enhance humor. The context, the environment will help dictate the level of acceptance from the audience. So if you are watching a TV show like The Office or Curb Your Enthusiasm, then that incongruity interaction is going to most likely be more accepted by you or the audience member because you are choosing to watch that. Similarly, if you are taking part in, some sort of a punked or prank, if you're in on it, you're going to have a higher level of acceptance. That's not the case with other communicators who fall victim into that communicative process that really had no meaning to do that. This also encourages open forum dialogue to help build rapport, identification, and shared experience of laughter, deprecation, and synergies, like we mentioned earlier on in humor appeals. Incongruity theory does have a bigger impact on society. So this is when taboo subjects shared in the public sphere can actually be more accepted and can help create a more relatable and identifiable experience. So essentially, the more we talk about taboo things, the more likely they are to become mainstream and become less taboo. More understanding can be developed and generated from that, cultivating a more acceptable feel of whatever taboo subject that can be. So furthermore, it brings awareness to taboo subjects, encouraging dialogue, and the potential to address stereotypes in a less threatening way, depending, of course, on the context or environment. Quote, comedians take these stereotypes and make them the center of a comedic joke, and this experience violates the expected norm of non-discussion. This also can emphasize cognition to decode violation of the norm and pattern. There's an extra step here which makes incongruity theory a highly evolved form of humor. Individuals must have rationally come to understand normal patterns of reality before they can notice differences. So it's important that the comic or the comedian or whoever it is that is initiating incongruity theory, for it to work, there has to be a level of comparison and differentiation to acceptable, more mainstream culture and society. So, as you figured out throughout this lecture, the role of the audience is so incredibly important when it comes to humor appeals. It's almost like, does persuasion exist if there's no audience member therefore to experience it? Similar to fear and humor as well. So the presence of humor in a message is shown to increase the value of a message. Let's examine that one more time. When humor is used in a message, it is shown to increase the value of that message, meaning that humor is a remarkable, important piece of communication, that it does have the power to enhance and impact in a great way communication. Researching and understanding why this is true allow others to create more effective messaging using humor as well. So the more we use humor in communication, the more it may cause a chain reaction of humor as well. Communicators can develop arguments and relay them to audiences without leaving the audience feeling attacked and offended. Again, another way humor can be used to break intensification and bring relief to certain scenarios. Comedians can also develop arguments intending to persuade the audience to agree with her or his reasoning. And in other words, that we can use humor to gain compliance in the message that we are trying to adopt. And then finally, enthymematic connection and decoding from audience is essential. That no matter who we're speaking with, whether it's a large audience or a one-on-one conversation, that audience member decoding and trying to interpret what we're saying and what we're meaning is of the utmost importance. Because if they do not understand or they cannot interpret what you're saying, then humor appeals are not taking place, persuasion cannot take place. And I'm just going to ask you ignore this slide. Cheers.